ICP's first webinar of the year with the title Dismantling Inequity. I'm Alta van Heerden, ICP President, and it is my privilege to introduce the presenter and facilitator for today. But before I do, let me remind you that if you want to comment or ask relevant questions during the presentation, you can do so by using the Q&A widget on the right-hand side of your screen. Your questions will be answered after the event. With that out of the way, allow me to do the introductions. The presenter for today is the Honourable Mary Robinson, and it is a privilege and honour to introduce her. Mary is Adjunct Professor for Climate Justice at Trinity College Dublin, and she's also the Chair of the Elders. She served as President of Ireland from 1990 to 1997 and UN High Commissioner for Human Rights from 1997 to 2002. She's a member of the Club of Madrid and the recipient of numerous honors and awards, including the Presidential Medal of Freedom from the President of the United States, Barack Obama. Between 2013 and 2016, Mary served as UN Secretary General's Special Envoy in 3 roles. First, for the Great Lakes region of Africa, then on climate change, and most recently as his Special Envoy on El Niño and climate. Her foundation, the Mary Robinson Foundation, Climate Justice, established in 2010, came to a planned end in April 2019. A former president of the International Commission of Jurists and former chair of the Council of Women World Leaders, she was president and founder of Realizing Rights, the Ethical Globalization Initiative from 2002 to 2010, and served as honorary president of Oxfam International 2002 to 2012. Mary Robinson serves as patron of the International Science Council and patron of the board of the Institute of Human Rights and Business, is an ambassador for the B team, in addition to being a board member of several organizations, including the Mo Ibrahim Foundation and the Aurora Foundation. She was the Chancellor of the University of Dublin from 1998 to 2019. Mary's memoir, Everybody Matters, was published in September 2012, and a book, Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for Sustainable Future, was published in September 2018. Thank you, Mary, for sharing your wisdom and knowledge with us today. Our facilitator for today is Maria Doyle, ICP representative for the European region on the Executive. We look forward to your discussions.
Hello, Mary.
Hello.
I would like to welcome you most sincerely to what we can hope to have today, a nice, convivial chat with a brilliant outcome for ICP. I'm delighted, first of all, to have this opportunity to talk to you about something that I know you have a passion about. And just earlier, you mentioned to me that you have 2 passions that we will be speaking about today, one being education and the second being equity, the whole question of equity. ICP as an organization, of course, does have a very strong centrality of equity in its strategic plan. And because of that, we have had a most consistent focus, I suppose, on it, just as it speaks to our purpose, the very reason why we exist, because we really do want and we desire to empower purposeful global leadership. That's really what underpins everything we do. So I'm going to start by asking you a very direct question, Mary, and that is, do you think that school leaders frequently underestimate their capacity or their ability or even their opportunity to bring about meaningful change?
Well, first of all, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, a good day to everybody listening or going to enjoy this recording of this event. I'm really pleased to be back with the International Confederation of Principals on such an important issue. Yes, maybe school principals do underestimate, because now, in particular, in our world today, we have to see education as preparation for life in the context of crises, of COVID, but behind that, the climate crisis, and frankly, even the nuclear situation. We need students who are empowered through the way they're educated to think for themselves, to be empowered to speak for themselves. That is happening more, I have to say, especially on the climate justice issue. The millions of children worldwide, and it's great to hear the voice of so many girls, not just Greta Thunberg, but thousands of girls now have taken the responsibility to speak out, taken the responsibility to strike. And I do think that whole movement should be really encouraged by school principals, and that it's an incredible important part of education for life in the context that we're in. And I cannot emphasize enough the urgency of that context. Let me put it this way, Maria. I sometimes say, and it startles people a little bit, that this year is probably one of the most important years for humanity, because we have two very important international gatherings. The Convention on Biological Diversity in China. It's supposed to be in May, and it's fixed. It was postponed from last year to May of this year. It may be postponed further, because if it's in May, it probably will have to be virtual. I don't think people want that. And then the Conference on Climate in Glasgow in November. We have to change course and head for a safe world. That's not the direct responsibility of principals, but it is a concern about how we see education now and preparation for this extraordinary time where we're not on course at the moment for a safe world, and that so affects the lives of students, because after all, there's an intergenerational inequity in that, an intergenerational injustice.
That's so interesting, because what you're saying there effectively is that we have a dual empowerment job to do. The empowerment of the leaders within the school context and the empowerment of the students and the children. And I suppose that can never start too early. So is the student voice then often forgotten about or ignored when we're asking these critical questions? Or do we give the children enough opportunity to voice their concerns, do you think?
I think in the past, certainly the student voice wasn't listened to enough. I think that is really changing. I think, again, it's changing because students themselves are speaking out more, and you have more students, participating collectively in schools. I'm familiar with the green schools. I think every school now should be a green school, as I say, preparing urgently for dealing with the crisis that's not going away, but rather becoming more urgent. And so I think principals have an opportunity almost to work with students to educate the wider community to the issues that they need to be thinking about more. And that's why I so appreciate the schools that are taking a lead on the Sustainable Development Goals as part of education, for example. And this is not an abstract thing. It's actually part of how we change. One of the goals is on consumption, production, and consumption. We need to sort of change our habits. And I often, when I'm speaking to audiences, say, all of us can do 3 steps, and maybe these are steps that principals could really encourage. And the first step is to make the climate crisis a reality in your own life, because it's that important. And you've made it a reality if you're doing something that you weren't doing as well before, recycling more carefully, not wasting as much, maybe thinking about your eating habits. And so that's the first step. The second step is to actually get cross or angry with those who have more responsibility. And that's governments, of course, but it's also cities, it's also corporations. And use your voice. If you're of voting age, use your vote. But join organizations or tell students that there are organizations they can become involved in to express that. And then the third thing, and again, schools can be very helpful here, we've got to imagine this world we need to be hurrying towards. We need to imagine it because it's going to be much healthier. It's going to have a lot of green jobs, different jobs, and they're going to be, healthy jobs. We must make sure that there is an equality in doing that. And in many ways, that's why I often talk about the injustice of climate change and the layers of injustice that we have to counter, and that actually COVID has brought out, if I can just put it that way.
Very true, Mary, and I want to bring up that whole opportunity that COVID is presenting in a little while. But looking at equity again in the context of education, and I hope that in doing so, we're not, making a differentiation between equity in education and equity in the broader sense. But how can we encourage our global audience of school leaders to first of all reflect on what's happening within their own communities, which you spoke about just a few minutes ago, and secondly, to empower them then to start to dismantle the inequity they have identified as barriers to the promotion of fairness for students? And that word dismantling was very carefully chosen because it's done in a structured way as opposed to the wrecking ball scenario. So how do you think we can manage that and, really bring about absolute change?
Well, Maria, I think we have to see this in the context now of COVID, which is affecting schools worldwide, some more than others because of the inbuilt inequities of poverty, etc. But clearly there won't be an immediate return to normal. The recovery will be phased over quite a long period, and there are likely, I think, to be setbacks. So there's a need to build forward better. I don't like the build back better. I think it's a build forward to create education systems that are more resilient to the disruption caused by global health crises and other emergencies, more flexible in terms of education delivery and meeting the real needs of all children and youth. And there are various things. I just, some of them I've just thought through in, preparing for this. Schools need to carry out a gender and social inclusion analysis to understand the risks for girls and boys and for subgroups. For example, girls with disabilities, girls and boys from poorest quintiles. They need to work with teachers and communities and involve women and girls in decisions about girls' education in particular. They need to ensure appropriate digital learning solutions. The digital divide is also very much part of the inequity at the moment, and that's essential to access learning and stay safe online. To incorporate flexible learning so as to recognize different situations, to maintain essential nutrition health services, and obviously to be aware of teenage girls and their menstruation needs and their need to be reaffirmed and made very positive about this experience, not the shame that so many girls, including me when I was growing up, felt during that period, and how we hid all the evidence of it. The schools can do a lot to address that. Obviously, bullying, as we know, and bullying in the digital age is even worse, also is part of trying to address these issues, and collect and monitor gender disaggregated data to inform schools and help to adapt. So these are at least some of the suggestions that I would make. I'm not a school principal myself. Probably, some listening will say, well, we're doing a lot of that anyway. But actually, COVID is devastating, especially in terms of education. Can I tell you, and I'm speaking now as chair of the elders, one of the really devastating things about the developing countries and education is that when girls drop out of school, they drop out more quickly than boys because of care responsibilities, etc. And more girls are pushed into early marriage or fall into early pregnancy. And the elders realized the problem of early child marriage when Archbishop Tutu was our chair, early on in our time. And we realized that 10 million girls a year marry far too early and have to drop out of school when that happens, more or less. Now some schools are allowing girls to come back, but it's not the norm still in many schools. And so we helped the organizations that were quietly trying to deal with this very sensitive issue for many countries. And we helped to form a huge network of those that became the organization Girls Not Brides. We went to Ethiopia, to the Amhara region there, and spoke to communities. We went to India, to the state of Bihar, to a school which was helping both boys and girls. We listened to girls saying that when they learned that a 14-year-old was hearing a conversation between the parents that was worrying, the other girls would come around and say, no, please let her stay for another year, until she's at least 15 before she has to marry probably a much older man. And Archbishop Tutu and Ela Bhatt, who was our Indian elder at the time, they went to talk to the boys in the school and said, you have to be champions of girls staying longer. You mustn't be involved in early marriage. You must, talk to your parents. Very interesting, trying to empower in that, in that extreme situation where girls are so much at risk of being, of the parents deciding, often for poverty reasons, that the girl should marry somebody else who will take care of that girl and take care of feeding her, for example, looking after her. So that's just one dimension of something that has been greatly exacerbated by COVID.
I'm very interested to hear you speak about that, Mary, because sometimes I feel that as a global community, we think that that only happens within third world countries, but it also happens in first world countries. Ireland also has an Indigenous population where girls as young as 15 are married and taken out of school. So we can't turn our backs and say it's only happening within the third world realm, because it's not. And period poverty, as you mentioned there as well, is a global issue. It's nothing to do with where you live. It's actually a global issue. So we can't deny this as being a factor. And it also brings me to another issue, which is during this pandemic, I'm quite sure that all of those Indigenous populations within different countries have suffered probably more than others because of the isolation and because of what they were thrown into, even the prevalence, I suppose, of COVID within their communities. Would you agree?
Yes, it's very clear, and it's starkly evident that COVID disproportionately affects brown, black, and Indigenous peoples in our world. It's very notable in the United States. It's become a cause of great scandal that the health statistics, it also affects women in the workplace and in the home far more, whether it's being locked into an abusive household and not being able to talk to anybody, being isolated, and what happens to a wife or children in those circumstances, or whether it's women disproportionately losing their jobs. But in many ways, if you'll allow me, Maria, I'll kind of come back to climate justice in this regard, because it's kind of interesting. It's COVID has exacerbated all of the inequalities and has linked them in a way that brings out a great feminist word, the intersectionality between the inequalities, the links between them. And that's also true of climate, of the injustice of climate. First of all, it disproportionately affects the poorest countries and communities and small island states and Indigenous peoples. And they're the least responsible. So that's the first injustice. Then there's the gender injustice within that women have different social roles, often have less power, less rights, like land rights, less access to capital, but they still have to put food on the table when there's terrible drought and when there's flooding, and they have to try and make their communities resilient. I wrote a book about that called Climate Justice, Hope, Resilience, and the Fight for a Sustainable Future. 11 stories, nine of them about women, but also 2 good men. And the third injustice is the one that children talk about now, the intergenerational injustice, which is why it's so important that this is part of the preparing for living of young, bright citizens, the students that come through the system. And the fourth injustice is the injustice of our pathways to development, that, you know, the industrialized world built their economies on fossil fuel and now have to wean themselves off with just transition, remembering that the workers helped to build the economies and they mustn't be forgotten. They must be part of the new jobs going forward and their communities. So the fifth injustice is the injustice to nature herself, that we've had such loss of biodiversity and extinction of species. And that's why I see this dual path we have to prepare for during this vital year. The Convention on Biological Diversity, the COP in Glasgow, these are not far away things. These are essential ideas for principles in educating young people who are using the voice more and more on the issue. But, you know, it's so vital.
It's bringing me back, Mary, I suppose, to a time when I was principal myself, which is not that long ago. And I do recall somebody saying to me, the children are the drivers. If you tell the children that they must recycle, they will come home and they will insist that the recycling happens within the home. So the onus is really on our school leaders to keep that message so very much prevalent and really empower those children. And I suppose in a funny way, it actually does level out the playing field for everybody, because it doesn't matter what your background is, who you are. If you're getting that message, you can influence that. Now, the other piece that I'm really interested in taking up with you as well is the whole idea of school now being so much part of the community. Before, schools were standalone. Now schools are influenced by and also influence the communities that they are placed in. And because of that, I suppose we have an even greater responsibility to look at equity within the community and look at inequities within our own schools and try and do something positive to actually change that and change the thinking. Would you agree, Mary?
I would agree very much. And once again, this is brought home far more during this time of COVID. First of all, how essential schools are. I mean, parents have realized, communities have realized, governments have realized how important schools are, and how necessary it is to have that equity. We are seeing the need for those who have special needs to go back to school earlier for obvious reasons. And that is beginning to happen in Ireland, and I'm sure and hope in other parts of the world. It's good in many ways that COVID has brought home how important education and schools are, and how much part of the community they are, and what a vital role they play. And this must be encouraging for principals to feel that sense of appreciation now more than ever of the role of schools and the role of teaching for young people to prepare them for this life, which is full of very urgent challenges that affect them, no matter what age they are. This crisis is intergenerational. This crisis is real, and it has to be part of a preparation. But also, let me be positive too about some of the things we can take from COVID. It has taught us that collective human behavior matters, because that's the only thing that's protecting us from the virus. So schools can, as you say, get good collective behavior by pupils that they bring home to their parents. The students educate their parents about, like less waste, recycling, learning the circular economy lessons, listening to the science and understanding it, as the young climate activists do so well. Secondly, government matters. And I think, that's something that has to be taught in school in a way, that governments have to have good policies for equity. And, that's a lesson that has to be brought home. Thirdly, that science matters. And obviously, that's an important lesson that can be reaffirmed in school. And I love STEM subjects for girls in particular, that there's equity in access to the STEM subjects, and that we still have to do a lot of work on that. And then a fourth lesson, and it's a really good one, is that compassion matters. We are seeing a lot of compassion for those less well off in different parts of the world. You know, the queues for food parcels in the United States, the richest country in the world, very often Black and brown and indigenous peoples who are queuing. But there is more empathy, there is more openness. And in many ways, you know, let's just reflect, you know, and let principals take on board what COVID has done. It has brought us back to basics of the fragility of our humanity, that a tiny virus we can't see has set us all back out of our comfort zone. And, you know, being out of your comfort zone may be a good thing, because the comfort may have been very unequal in your society. And now, that's why I say I don't like build back better, even though the UN uses it and President Biden uses it. I like build forward with equality and justice and fairness, and realizing the need to tackle all the inequities.
Yes, I'm completely on board with what you're saying, and it brings to mind something that Michael Ryan has been saying, and I know you are a fan of Michael Ryan's.
He's a great man. He's a great man.
Oh, an amazing individual, and was underrated until, I suppose, now. But he would also talk about that element of compassion, and particularly where he's saying, you know, distribute the vaccines to everybody. Yes. Don't hoard them. Don't just give them to all of your healthy population. Think of the places where there is inequity and where these people will not have seen any of the vaccines, and share. And this is his message. And I think you absolutely have it spot on there. You know, the next generation, who are the children that are going back into school now, are the ones that are going to make the real difference, because they will be the ones building forward, because they don't have a back to go to. They are the ones that have the forward that they want to go to. And they will actually have us doing that without even realizing. Would you agree?
Yes, and I do want to come back to that important point about the inequity in access to vaccines. The elders have been very supportive of the global COVAX initiative. And in fairness, the G7 the other day made much more commitment, and Biden, on behalf of the United States, made a commitment. But I heard the Secretary General of the UN, Antonio Guterres, whom I obviously know very well, speaking about the fact that there are 130 countries that haven't had a single vaccine, not a single vaccine. And, you know, countries are rolling out and trying to reach more and more of their population. And I was, you know, glad that the point was made by the new head of the WTO, Ngozi from Nigeria, who's also a good friend of mine. She made the point and has made it consistently. It's not a case of when you've vaccinated all of your population that the leftovers would be shared with developing countries. That is nonsense, because unless we're all done together, it won't work. You know, if there are countries that still have not been vaccinated, they will reinfect and the virus will mutate, and you know, it will help nobody. So there are powerful voices that are making that point, but it is part of the overall inequality that has been so exacerbated and exposed by COVID. And therefore, we can't, you know, we have to make connections now between the different inequalities, between the Black Lives Matter and the Me Too campaign and the campaign against violence against women. This is the year of generation equality, marking 25 years from Beijing, the Beijing conference. We were supposed to have done it last year. We're going to do it as well as possible in Mexico and in Paris this year. And that gender inequality, poverty inequality, racial inequality, LGBT discrimination inequality, all of that has to be kind of connected in a way that takes us out of our silos. We should all have a link. We should see the intersectionality, that great feminist term, and you know, work and schools and school principals can really do a great deal to have this as the preparation for building forward with equality and justice.
And I'm so excited by the idea that, you know, from the very youngest to the oldest students can actually be part of all of that, because children understand from a very young age what inequality actually means. They can see it where we probably don't, and they understand it where we probably don't. But I agree with you, Mary, that now is an opportune time for schools and school leaders to come out of their comfort zone and to start talking about all of these issues and all of these inequalities that have been highlighted through COVID. And my next question to you will be, how can an organization such as ICP become an influencer on that platform and actually look for real change in the area of inequity? You're very adept through your connections, you know, at being an influencer yourself and your groups. But how can ICP become part of that influencer model so that we can get our voice out there and really make significant change happen within this education sector?
Well, as I said earlier, there's no doubt that during this awful COVID period, we have understood the importance of education, the importance of schools, and therefore the importance of school principals and the importance of their voice in the community where the school is located. Because, you know, it's hard to exaggerate. You can't exaggerate how serious the climate crisis is and how urgent it is and how important it is that we take the steps. And those steps are perfectly doable. There's no doubt about that. And we're beginning to be on the right course. We are seeing governments commit to being zero carbon by 2050, including Ireland and a significant number of other countries now. We're seeing corporations commit. We're seeing cities commit. The trouble is they're committing to be zero carbon by 2050, but they're not working backwards to what does that mean in 2030? And that's the important decade now. It's not even a decade, it's less than a decade. But that's the commitment to do with the conference in Glasgow. School principals should be speaking out in their community about the need to ensure that the city and the country is on track for making sure there is a safe world for students in the future. It's as serious as that. And they are very credible on it because they are, you know, the knowledge sharers, the knowledge deliverers for the future generation. And they should understand that they can have a real voice in the community on this, and a more respected one, because COVID has brought home 100% how important schools and education really are.
Absolutely, and that whole centrality of education, I think, is seen worldwide. It's not just seen in pockets, we'll say like Europe or Australia, but it's definitely seen globally, which I suppose we were not as familiar with before because we weren't talking about it to the same extent. I'd like to.
Yeah, I'm very keen on the. I'm very keen on the Drive for 5 for adolescent girls. That
was coming. That was my next question.
Oh, okay. Well, go ahead.
No, I was just interested in the whole area of the Drive for 5 because a number of years ago in Johannesburg, ICP did spearhead a conversation around the struggle for gender equity, and it was actually hosted in the Oprah Winfrey Leadership Academy for Girls. Now, for various reasons, it hasn't really progressed since then, but listening to you today and understanding where we are with COVID, I think we have an opportunity now to really invest in that again. And it is quite similar in ways to your Drive for 5. Could you give us a little bit more information for those who may not know what that was about? And it was launched last year, I understand that.
Yes, that's right. It's a call for action for education for adolescent girls. And it's part of the generation equality year. It was supposed to be 2020. That's why we launched it in 2020. But it's clear that we have to reinvigorate it, even more so because of COVID in 2021. And the 5 things are very simple and very straightforward, and I love them for adolescent girls. First of all, she has a desk, guaranteeing access to 12 years of free quality education. So specific actions to promote girls' re-entry to school, including engaging communities in advance of schools reopening, very important as they reopen after COVID, ensuring there are no policies or practices, for example, pregnancy testing or ban on pregnant girls, that deter girls from enrolling, providing cash transfers, scholarships, food, sanitary supplies, and other social supports, encouraging teachers, principals, and school committees to make direct contact with vulnerable girls at risk of dropping out. That's the first one. She has a desk. Secondly, she is confident, supporting girls' confidence in learning environments. We can, build forward better by providing supportive school environments through gender-sensitive curriculums, mentoring, and menstrual hygiene facilities. The role of boys and men in challenging negative social norms and eliminating harmful traditional practices. The third one, she learns the skills she needs, ensuring girls receive the necessary skills they need, strengthen teacher training to provide girls with quality, relevant education for life, employment, and leadership opportunities. And obviously the STEM subjects are really important there. Fourthly, she is safe, keeping girls safe in schools. In building forward better, we must ensure that every girl is safe from violence in school and on the journeys to and from schools. And this requires a holistic approach that addresses the drivers and root causes of violence at both the school and at community levels. And fifthly, she is healthy, promoting the health of girls and ensuring access to water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities. And we know that school meals help to get children, especially girls, into school and keep them there. And water and sanitation facilities, especially in single-sex toilets and menstrual hygiene management facilities, need to be available to girls in school to ensure a dignified, gender-equitable learning environment and to reduce absenteeism and facilitate girls' retention during adolescence, which is so important. Every extra year is so important for a girl in her future life.
And on that point, Mary, I was very taken by some of the points you made there. I'm broadening it out a little bit. Do you think it's going to be difficult for the back to school community now to re-engage with those most marginalized children and the children from the most disadvantaged areas and encourage them back into school again? Do you think we're going to have a job on our hands, a difficulty now re-engaging with people who probably have become very disengaged throughout this COVID experience?
Very much so, Maria. And I think many of your principals listening and tuning in will know this. Even the loss of the time, some students don't have computers or don't have access to Wi-Fi, can't avail of digital, so they lose out badly. I mentioned already those with additional needs suffer greatly, as do their families. They see their children going backwards. There are harrowing stories of mothers, talking about the child, disimproving so visibly because of lack of access to education. And it will be difficult, and it will be, and it's why we need to prioritize, as we are doing now in Ireland, and I hope other countries are doing that also. Those children with special needs do need to get to school more quickly if they have to open a bit more gradually. It's also true of students that are at the age where they have examinations that are going to determine their future, whether they, what choices they have of third level education or apprenticeship or whatever it may be, how important it is for them. And so, principals will play a big role, I hope, in helping to address what will be an increasing inequality and inequity. It has been exacerbated badly by COVID, but we can also understand the kind of lessons that COVID has taught us.
And I suppose in some ways there will probably be a need to actually make the phone calls, to make the house visits, to actually go the extra mile, to re-engage with families that could very well feel now that, you know, they've lost interest or they've lost their sense of purpose. While many families, and this is the majority of families, will be delighted to support their children going back to school, there will be many who actually will not feel the same way. So I suppose in some ways it will be a job, and it will be incumbent on school leaders now to go that extra mile and maybe to engage with their communities more in trying to get that moving. Find people within the communities that people trust and try and encourage people back in. So that whole sense of community after a crisis will become even more important, would you say, Mary, into, you know, in the coming months particularly?
I think you've put that very well as a former principal. I don't think I could add anything to it. I think it is true. There will have to be more outreach. There will have to be more thought. There will have to be more engagement.
Tell me, Mary, a little bit more, and going back to the Drive for Five, who has actually taken the idea on board? Do you have countries and governments who are saying, yes, we are willing to actually take this and to run with it and do our very best to, you know, listen to what you've said? And you're correct in saying there are 5 very achievable targets, if you want to put it in education language. But who has actually said and stood up and said, we will actually do this?
Well, actually, you know, when we had our launch, and it was the physical launch in the UN, it was great to see so many developing countries signing up. I haven't got the exact total now, but it has actually been embraced by a lot of developing countries and support by a lot of developed countries to ensure, and you know, it's really very integrated into this year of generation equality. I can't emphasize enough the need to support the various ways in which UN Women has the action areas for greater equality and the importance of that. And the Drive for Five is the particular targeting of adolescent girls, as I say. But you know, we've been talking about the broader equity, rightly, right across the board, and the importance of boys and men in helping generation equality going forward. So I think the campaign has been very well launched. I'm proud of the role that Ireland has played in it, but it has been taken up by a lot of countries, both developed and developing. And in particular, it's good so many developing countries see those 5 steps, and she is there with her desk, and you know, she is confident, she is healthy, etc. You know, there's an empowering approach to it, which I like very much.
And to go back to something you said earlier, the empowerment of boys and men to actually stand up and to name when they see, you know, inequity, and to name when injustice is happening to the females within their families, within their communities. I think giving that voice to young men and to young students in school is vital if we are to actually have any success in the realm of, you know, girls' education and tackling all of those inequalities that do impact hugely on girls specifically. So I like the synergy you've made between empowering the men and the boys to speak up for their female counterparts and say, you know, we don't like this anymore. This is not right. Yeah. This is not just, because that was certainly not the case up to very recently, in fact.
Yeah, no, it's very true. Sorry. And UN Women have taken that to a different level. A few years ago, the UN Women decided to get heads of state, presidents and prime ministers, to engage on the issue of equality of girls and boys. And it's called the He for She campaign. And many heads of state, including our own president, Michael D. Higgins, are part of that he for she. That's important because if a president is saying girls are as important as boys, and all our society and our schools must reflect that, that's also important. Of course, it hasn't penetrated as fully as it still would need to be, because we still have very high violence against women and girls, and unfortunately, again, COVID has exacerbated that.
Can you talk to me a little bit about how ICP as a global organization, you know, that represents school leaders, can form purposeful partnerships? You know, and I mean that in the very positive way, really purposeful partnerships to advance the work, you know, that we do. Because sometimes I think partnerships are made because there seems to be a financial incentive to make that partnership work. But I'd like to talk to you a little bit more about purposeful partnerships that where you have the same goals and you have the same thought processes without any recourse to finance or to financial aid. How can we as an organization, you know, eke out these purposeful partnerships and make them real then for us and give us a little bit more, I suppose, credibility moving forward with what we consider to be our goals and our aims?
Well, you know, this is the way forward. It's collaborative partnerships that are going to help us with the various crises that we face. And, you know, the UN has been encouraging more and more civil society engagement and partnerships in support of the need for countries to commit to be zero carbon at or before 2050, and to do that in this COP in November that will take place in Glasgow, the COP being the conference on climate. And you know, a lot of the private sector is beginning to engage, not all of it at all, and not enough of it, but some of it is giving some leadership. I think, again, taking maybe even more courage, if you like, from the recognition of the importance of education and therefore of schools and therefore of principals, that ICP could be a real part of an engagement with resolving the crisis of our time, which is the climate crisis. The COVID crisis will pass with vaccination and and maybe we'll have other, we know, we're warned, we may have other viruses that could be very damaging, but it will pass. Addressing the climate crisis, and actually maybe also, you know, I don't want to go into this too much, but it is an issue that elders are very concerned also about the nuclear crisis. And I remember, Maria, how much in the 80s we marched and really thought about the nuclear situation. It has got worse, but it's somehow off the agenda. So we need thoughtful thought leaders, I would say, and principals can be thought leaders in what the community should be concerned about.
You're bringing me back to the iodine tablets that we all had in a drawer for so many years, that many people still haven't thrown away for fear of a nuclear crisis. Of course, they're no longer effective, but I'm really liking the idea that you're instilling in me, and I hope in our audience today, that the power is really within the hands of the school leaders now, because of what COVID has done in escalating, I suppose, education to an even higher platform. But also that change can happen at very local level within your own community if you just identify the areas that you need to actually make those changes work. So I'm liking that idea, and I'm liking the idea that ICP as the global association can support those leaders to do just that and empower them to say, look at what's happening in your schools. When you go back, identify one or two key areas that you want to influence and work forward with that, because now is the optimum time to do that. And it brings me back to what you said earlier. We do only have a short window of opportunity to make change happen because it is so high on the global agenda right now. So I think we need to emphasize that. Would you agree? The window of opportunity will not be there forever.
Yeah, it's really quite acute. I remember Ban Ki-moon, who was the Secretary General, who gave me 3 mandates over a relatively short period, being very focused on how important it was to get the Paris Agreement. And he kept saying over and over again, we're the last generation, we're the first generation to fully understand the seriousness of the climate crisis, and the last generation to be able to do something about it. Now, the scientists have put it even more acutely. They issued a report, the IPCC, the global scientists, issued a report in October 2018 about how important it was that the whole world stays at or below 1.5 degrees of warming, not 2 degrees and certainly not over 2 degrees, because between 1.5 and 2 degrees, bad things happen. Possibly the whole of the Arctic ice will disappear. The coral reefs may disappear, and the permafrost, and there's a whole, huge areas of permafrost may melt and throw up not just carbon, but also methane, which is even more lethal, if you like. And so they said you have 10 years to get on track to be able to be zero emissions by 2050. And they said to do that, you have to reduce by 45% carbon emissions between now and 2030. And in October 2018, they said you have 12 years. Now we have less than 10. That's how acute it is. But it's doable, as I say, and we're in the process of making it doable, but it's going to be a big push. Bill Gates, who is a very powerful man who's done a lot in supporting vaccinations globally, and his foundation's done a lot of good work. He's just written a book in which he describes the nature of the challenge and that it is doable with huge effort. So, that's why principals can really be part of a community. We need 2 ways of working on it. We need the top down, the real responsibility of governments, of leaders of corporations, of investment. Mark Carney, who was the former governor of the Bank of England, is saying we need mandatory measures to reduce carbon, to get out of fossil fuel, etc. That's the top down. And cities are part of the top down. And then there's the bottom up, there's the whole community effort to engage with a circular economy, to engage with new green jobs, to engage with the importance of making houses more energy efficient. Our houses waste a lot of energy in many parts of the world because we don't insulate them. There are jobs to be had in that. We just need to encourage, and our government policy in Ireland is much better now in climate, but it needs a whole of community approach, and principals can really lead at the local level on that, I believe.
You're giving me great hope for the whole idea of empowerment. And I suppose another aspect that you're bringing to the fore is that whole importance of networking and engagement within that whole, I suppose, leadership community. In other words, having school leaders in Ireland, networking with school leaders in Australia and in Canada and in India and in Singapore, and talking about these issues together and looking at the centrality of what they can actually do and what's achievable. And I think you're making that point very clearly, that we need to talk more together and to network more, which, let's be honest, is so much simpler now because of the way that technology has improved. So that's a point I'm going to take away very, very much from what we've talked about. Can I throw a very direct question to you, Mary? Why do you think we see so few principals and school leaders from minority groups?
Yes, it's a very good question. You know, it's true perhaps of teachers down the line too, to some extent, in different communities and parts of the world. I think it's, you know, it's the way we see also that girls, that women have only recently become principals of schools. Before it used to be men, even of girls' schools, and somehow it would be male teachers who would become the principals. So, you know, if you have a gender discrimination, you're going to have a racial discrimination. You're going to have, and it's the intersectionality of that. If you're a woman of color, even less likely. You know, these are the kinds of issues that we need to address now. In again, the heightened awareness that we have of all of these inequalities, and that, you know, is due to the fact that they have been so exacerbated by COVID and the intersectionality between them so brought out. And I therefore, you know, feel there's a real possibility of it not being acceptable not to tackle building forward.
Okay, one I suppose penultimate question I'd like to ask you is this: why is it important, do you think, Mary, to distinguish between inequity and inequality?
Well,
or between equity and inequality?
Yes, yeah. I think I've been more focused on the extent to which COVID has brought out the inequalities, you know, racial inequality, gender inequality, etc. Equity is a kind of managing of that within a context of ensuring, given that there are those potential discriminations in the wider context, make sure they don't impact in the school, have an equity within a school framework. Whereas, you know, the truth is, it's a much wider question to tackle those inequalities in the whole of society. We need to do it, but principals can try to address within a school system greater equity and greater inclusion and greater, you know, support that is done with the kind of drive for 5 steps and other steps that we've been discussing.
That's interesting. So I hadn't made that connection before, that highlighting all those inequalities actually gets us to the core of equity or inequity. So the highlighting of the inequalities brings us back to, because it's more centralized and it's more based in your community, and it's more doable then. And finally, I want to ask you, having had this discussion, do you consider, Mary, that a drive towards dismantling inequity in education is actually feasible, or is it aspirational?
I think we can't underestimate the difficulties. I know there will be some principals who say, look, I'm in a developing country, we've lost the you know, opportunity to continue with our students at the moment. We don't have a digital opportunity. You know, in other words, there are going to be differences in different schools, different parts of the world, of how affected by COVID. But I do really feel that all principals can take heart from the fact that education has moved up our perception of what is important in our world. There's no doubt about that. And you know, it's rightly so, but it's good. And therefore, principals can, within their community, insist upon more support for the equity they want to bring about, and can, you know, be a stronger voice in tackling some of the wider inequalities in order to get that equity within the school. And so, you know, I really want to encourage, I mean, principals are thought leaders within their school. They can also be thought leaders within their community, and they can help to address what will be a very, very difficult building forward better, because we will have more equality and justice. I don't underestimate it all, but I know, because of the urgency of the climate crisis, we have no option but to really roll up our sleeves and make every effort to build forward with that equality and fairness.
Mary, I'm thinking strongly here about that whole area of well-being and wellness. And I think that if we manage this well and build up the resilience and the well-being of our global leadership, that they will speak up and they will take that challenge and they will rise to that challenge, because it is within their power to do so. And I fully support what you say, that the window of opportunity for this is very short. But I also have great faith in our global leaders, that when push comes to shove, they have done a miraculous job already by engaging in a whole different form of learning. And I've no doubt that they will actually step up to the mark again when dealing with these global crises that are coming down the tracks so quickly at us. Mary Robinson, can I thank you most sincerely for your engagement with me today? It's been a wonderful experience for me on a personal level. And I'm sure that our global community of school leaders who are listening now or who will listen later on will be enthralled with some of the aspects that you have brought to the fore for us today. Thank you, Mary. It has been an honor and a privilege to talk to you.
Well, thank you, Maria. It's also been a pleasure for me. I spent an awful lot of time in my life teaching, and I feel I'm still engaged in teaching and learning in the context of climate justice, and trying to engage as chair of the elders in the issues like the nuclear issue, like access to health, access to justice globally that we're involved in. But I've always felt that education was incredibly important, and I'm glad that that is one key lesson from COVID that should be very encouraging to individual principals and to the ICP to give the kind of leadership you can give.
Good day to Slán, Mary. May you agus Slán leat.
Okay.
Plenty of food for thought there in our conversation with Mary Robinson this morning. And I would like to thank all of you who have engaged with us and who have listened intently for the last hour to what I believe was an enthralling conversation with an exceptional world leader. Can I just bring to your attention now, as members of ICP particularly, what's happening into the future for ICP members? Our next webinar, I'm delighted to be able to say, will take place on the 4th of May, and it's with our very good friend, Steve Mumby. And the topic that he will be bringing to us will be Paradoxes in Education Leadership, Managing the Tension of Duality. And I'm most interested in even trying to declunk that title. Never mind, listen to what Steve has to say on the subject. Our first ICP magazine will be with you in April, and we hope to actually continue this conversation on inequality and equity in that publication. And can I also please encourage you to go online to www.icp.org for any information that you might like to have or to get in relation to what's happening and what's going to be happening down the line with ICP for 2021. Unfortunately, we have had to cancel our convention in Toronto this year, but it will happen in 2022 in Toronto in July, and we so look forward to engaging with our OPC colleagues in 2022. However, our council meeting will still take place in August, and you will receive up-to-date information on how we will be managing that virtually in due course. Can I wish you all well, and thank you for listening in today to what has been our very first webinar of 2021. Slán, as we say here,